My millionaire boss leaned back with a smirk. Congratulations, Patricia. We're promoting Susan. She's smarter, quicker, and far more valuable than you'll ever be. Honestly, you should thank us for keeping you around this long. The team chuckled under their breath as my face burned red. I calmly slid an envelope across his desk. Thanks for the opportunity. He had no clue what was inside. It was like a silent explosion going off in the room, the applause for Susan's promotion still ringing in my ears. But for me, it was the sound of a fuse finally reaching its end. Harold was there, absolutely basking in the glow of the management team's approval, completely oblivious to the hurricane I was about to unleash. Jennifer from marketing was shaking Susan's hand, Mike from operations already chattering about transition plans, and I was pulling an envelope from my briefcase that held the power to utterly obliterate every single person in that room who had ever found joy in my humiliation. 15 years of playing the nice, patient, understanding professional was about to culminate in the most spectacular, soul-satisfying fashion imaginable. But to truly understand what happened that day, we have to go back. Not just last week when Harold called this meeting, but 15 years ago. I was 25, fresh out of business school, walking through those gleaming glass doors for the very first time. My hair was pulled back in a neat bun, my mother's pearl earrings, my lucky charm, gleamed softly, and clutched in my hand was the leather portfolio my father had given me for graduation. I genuinely believed I was walking into my dream job at Meridian Solutions. Harold was a different man back then. Younger, hungrier, still desperately trying to prove he deserved the CEO position his father-in-law had simply handed to him. He hired me as a junior marketing associate, painting a beautiful picture of growth opportunities, of mentorship, of a future. And I believed him. I needed to. My college loans weren't going to pay themselves, and Harold's generous offer meant I could finally get my own apartment, escape moving back in with my parents. Those early years, they were intoxicating. I threw myself into every single project. I stayed late, polishing presentations until they gleamed. I came in on weekends, digging deep into market research no one else wanted to touch. When Harold needed anyone, to take on the beast that was the Miller Industries account, I was the first to raise my hand. When the Henderson Group demanded a complete rebranding strategy in 3 weeks flat, I locked myself in the office and made it happen. When our biggest client threatened to bolt because of some competitor's lowball offer, I flew to Chicago on my own dime and single-handedly saved that relationship. Each victory, each success, felt like another brick in the foundation of something truly monumental. Harold would call me into his office after those big wins, pour himself a whiskey, and tell me, "Patricia, you're my secret weapon." He'd lean back in that massive leather chair, swirling the amber liquid, and say things like, "Patricia, you're going to run this place someday." I meticulously saved every single email where he praised my work. I kept copies of every client thank you letter that specifically mentioned my name, my contributions. I documented everything, because I truly believed it was all building my undeniable case for advancement. The Meridian account, that was my masterpiece. 6 grueling months of intense research, competitor analysis, strategic planning. It culminated in a campaign so wildly successful, it tripled their market share in our region. The day the client called to extend their contract for another 5 years, Harold called an emergency meeting. I walked in, my heart thrumming with anticipation, expecting congratulations, maybe even a hint about that promotion he'd been dangling in front of me for so long. Instead, Harold announced that Tom Richardson would be taking over as marketing director. Tom, who had been with the company for a grand total of 8 months. Tom, whose biggest accomplishment, as far as I could tell, was managing not to spill coffee on his keyboard. "But Harold," I said, my voice suddenly smaller than I intended, "the Meridian account was my project, from start to finish." He didn't even bother to look up from his paperwork. "Tom brings a fresh perspective, Patricia. Sometimes we get too close to our work. Besides, you're so good at execution. Why fix what isn't broken?" That was the exact moment I realized Harold's compliments were actually chains. Being indispensable simply meant being stuck. Being reliable meant being taken for granted. Being loyal meant being utterly expendable whenever someone new, someone more exciting, came along. Tom lasted 18 months before he was promoted to regional director. Sarah Martinez stepped into his shoes, lasting 2 years before moving up to vice president. Then came Daniel Kim, followed by Marcus Webb. Each one climbed over my back, using my efforts as stepping stones to reach heights I was apparently destined to support, but never, ever achieve myself. My marriage to Robert started cracking around year 8. He'd come home to find me at the kitchen table at midnight, hunched over Harold's latest manufactured crisis, surrounded by printouts and empty coffee cups. "You love that job more than you love me," Robert said one night, his voice laced with resignation. And I couldn't argue because, in that moment, it felt true. Work was the only place I received any recognition, where my efforts actually seemed to matter, where I had a purpose. Home just felt like another place where I wasn't quite enough. The divorce was finalized 3 years ago, on a Tuesday morning. I signed the papers in a lawyer's office that smelled distinctly of stale leather and fresh disappointment, then went straight to work because Harold needed the quarterly projections updated. I cried in my car during lunch, just for a few minutes, then spent the entire afternoon in Harold's office, discussing budget allocations. He knew about the divorce. I'd requested time off for court dates, but he never once asked how I was doing. He just loaded more work onto my plate because, suddenly, I was available evenings and weekends. After Robert left, Meridian became everything. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty. So, I started arriving earlier, leaving later. Harold, of course, noticed my increased availability. He started treating me like his personal assistant rather than a marketing professional with 15 years of battle-hardened experience. Schedule his doctor's appointments, Patricia. Pick up his dry cleaning. Handle his wife's charity event planning. You're so good with details. I told myself it was temporary. I convinced myself that proving my versatility would finally earn me the recognition I deserved. I made endless excuses for Harold's increasingly dismissive behavior because acknowledging the truth would have meant admitting I'd wasted half my career on a man who saw me as convenient, not capable. Then Susan arrived for her interview. It was a Thursday morning in March. I watched from my desk as Harold transformed into someone I hadn't seen in years. He actually stood when she entered his office. He offered her coffee from his personal machine, the good stuff, you know, the blend he usually reserved for board members. Through his glass office walls, I could see him leaning forward, utterly engaged, in a way that made my stomach clench with that familiar, sickening dread. Susan was younger than me, but certainly not inexperienced. 38, with an impressive resume and the kind of confident, vibrant energy that effortlessly filled a room. She wore a burgundy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. And she spoke with Harold like they were equals, discussing mutual interests, not interviewer and candidate. I knew Harold was going to hire her before she even left the building. I knew she'd get the marketing director position I'd been performing, without the title, for 3 years now. I knew because I recognized that predatory look in Harold's eyes, the same one he'd shown with Sarah and all the others. What I didn't expect was how quickly everything would happen. Susan started the following Monday, and by Friday, Harold was announcing her promotion to marketing director during our regular team meeting. He stood at the head of the conference table, his usual spot for delivering pronouncements, and spoke about Susan's fresh vision and innovative approaches, while I sat there, feeling completely invisible. Susan brings exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need to take Meridian to the next level, Harold declared, his voice carrying that false enthusiasm he reserved for important occasions. Her experience with digital transformation will revolutionize how we approach client engagement. Digital transformation. I had been pushing for those exact initiatives for 2 years, writing proposals that Harold had dismissed as premature and overly ambitious. Now, Susan would get credit for implementing my ideas with my research, using strategies I developed through months of industry analysis. The management team applauded politely. Jennifer from marketing looked genuinely pleased, probably hoping Susan's promotion would create advancement opportunities for her. Mike from operations was already discussing integration plans with Harold. David from finance was taking notes about budget allocations for Susan's new department. And I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing the same professional smile I'd perfected over 15 years of soul-crushing disappointment. Inside, something fundamental was shifting. The hopeful young woman who'd walked through those doors, pearls for luck and all, was finally completely dead. In her place sat someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up a document I'd been meticulously maintaining for 3 years, adding Harold's latest betrayal to a steadily growing list of grievances. Then I opened a new browser window and began researching employment lawyers who specialized in discrimination cases. Not because I planned to sue Harold, not yet, but because I needed to understand exactly what constituted actionable workplace misconduct. That evening, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before driving home, meticulously planning my strategy. Harold thought he'd won by promoting Susan over me. He had no idea he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. The victim he'd created over 15 years was about to become his worst nightmare. And I was going to enjoy every single moment of his destruction. Susan's appointment was just the catalyst. The real explosion was already building inside me, and Harold was about to learn that patience isn't weakness. It's preparation. My opportunity came Tuesday morning during Susan's second week. She stood at the coffee machine, looking completely frustrated as it beeped angrily at her selections. Harold's fancy espresso maker required a specific sequence that nobody had bothered explaining to the new marketing director. I approached with my usual morning cup, watching her jab buttons with increasing irritation. "Try holding the brew button for 3 seconds first," I said, stepping beside her. Harold never tells anyone, but the machine resets itself overnight. Susan looked at me with genuine gratitude, not the polite, almost dismissive acknowledgement most new hires offered. "Thank you." I was starting to think it had something against me personally. Her laugh was warm, natural, nothing like the calculated charm I'd watched her use with Harold. "Everything here has its quirks," I said, adding my usual sugar packet. "I'm Patricia, by the way. I handle most of the client correspondence and project coordination." "Susan Martinez," she replied, her eyes meeting mine, "and I have a feeling you handle a lot more than that." Her comment caught me off guard. Something in her tone suggested she'd already noticed the glaring gap between my official title and my actual responsibilities. I studied her face, looking for any signs of Harold's coaching or manipulation. Instead, I saw intelligence and an awareness that made my chest tighten with a cautious, almost terrifying hope. "Harold mentioned you've been here 15 years, Susan continued. "That's impressive loyalty." Loyalty is one way to put it. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Susan's eyebrows raised slightly, and I realized I'd just given her information Harold definitely wouldn't want shared. "Would you mind showing me around the office properly?" she asked. Harold's tour was rather limited. Over the next hour, I walked Susan through our actual workflow, not Harold's sanitized, executive-level version. I showed her the Real client files, explained our intricate relationship management system, and pointed out the countless processes that kept Meridian running smoothly, day in and day out. Susan asked sharp, incisive questions about client retention rates, campaign effectiveness metrics, and team collaboration structures. Her questions revealed someone who understood business operations far better than Harold's promotional speech had suggested. "Patricia, can I ask you something?" Susan paused beside my desk, glancing toward Harold's closed office door, a hint of unease in her eyes. "Yesterday, Harold explained my role, but nothing he described matches what I'm seeing here. Are there unofficial responsibilities I should know about?" This was my first real test. Susan could be fishing for information to report back to Harold, or she could be genuinely trying to understand her new, clearly undefined position. I chose my words carefully, watching her reactions for any sign of deception. Harold sometimes focuses on big-picture vision rather than operational details. You might find that your actual responsibilities evolve naturally as you settle in. "Evolve into what exactly?" she pressed. "Because if I'm honest, some of the projects Harold described sound like work that's already being done, and quite expertly, by someone else." The directness of her statement surprised me. Susan wasn't playing games or speaking in corporate doublespeak. She was asking me straight out if Harold had hired her to do my job without acknowledging my existence. "That's very perceptive," I said, testing the waters further. "Harold values fresh perspectives on established processes." Susan set down her coffee mug and looked directly at me, her gaze unwavering. "Patricia, I've been in this industry for 12 years. I know when someone's being tactful about a difficult situation. Are you trying to tell me that Harold hired me to replace work you're already doing?" Her bluntness was so refreshing after years of Harold's manipulative communication style. In that moment, I made a decision that would either end my career spectacularly or begin my revenge with a powerful ally. Over the next few days, I set up careful tests of Susan's character. Wednesday morning, I casually mentioned Harold's habit of arriving late to client calls, then watched to see if Susan would repeat this information to him. She didn't. Thursday afternoon, I shared my concerns about the Anderson Group's budget issues, wondering if Susan would use this insider knowledge to impress Harold. Instead, she asked thoughtful follow-up questions about how we might address their financial constraints. Friday brought the real test. Harold called an impromptu meeting about the Mitchell Corporation proposal, asking for fresh eyes on our strategy. I watched Susan's face carefully as Harold completely dismissed my input while lavishly praising her minimal contributions. After the meeting, I found Susan in the supply closet, gripping a stack of folders so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Are you okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "No, I'm not okay." Susan turned to face me, her professional mask completely gone. "Patricia, what just happened in there wasn't normal management behavior. Harold treated you like you were invisible. Then he expected me to agree with his assessment of work you clearly understood better than anyone in that room." Relief flooded through me. Susan had seen through Harold's performance, recognizing his manipulation for what it truly was. She wasn't complicit in my mistreatment. She was disturbed by it. "Harold has very specific ideas about how meetings should go," I said carefully. "That wasn't a meeting," Susan countered, her voice sharp with indignation. "That was Harold showcasing his authority while systematically undermining someone who's obviously more capable than he is." Susan sat down the folders and crossed her arms. "Patricia, I need you to tell me the truth about what's really happening here." "The truth is complicated," I admitted. "Try me. I can handle complicated." That evening, we stayed until well past 7 p.m. The office building had emptied, save for the security guards and cleaning crew, creating a bubble of privacy where Susan and I could finally speak honestly. I made fresh coffee and we settled into the conference room, where we'd have space to spread out documents. "Before we start," Susan said, her eyes serious, "I want you to know that Harold has already started making inappropriate comments. Nothing actionable yet, just testing boundaries. Comments about my appearance, suggestions that we discuss strategy over dinner, invitations to after-work events that feel more social than professional." My heart sank. Harold was moving faster than usual. Probably because Susan's sheer competence threatened his fragile control even more than previous hires had. "That's exactly how it started with Sarah," I told her, then proceeded to lay out Harold's complete, chilling pattern of behavior. I showed Susan the resignation letters from Harold's previous female employees, all citing a hostile work environment without explicitly naming harassment. I explained how Harold had learned to operate just within legal boundaries, subtly creating conditions unbearable enough to drive women away, without ever crossing the line into overtly fireable offenses. "But why haven't you left?" Susan asked, her gaze intense. "With your skills and experience, you could work anywhere." The question pierced deeper than I expected. Why hadn't I left? Pride, stubbornness, fear of starting over, or something darker, something deeply ingrained. Because leaving would mean Harold won. It would mean accepting that 15 years of my life meant nothing, that my contributions were worthless, that I was exactly as disposable as he claimed. Susan nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "So, you're planning something?" "I'm planning everything," I confirmed, a flicker of something cold and determined in my eyes. "The question is whether you're interested in helping me destroy Harold's career permanently, or if you'd prefer to become his next victim, quietly." Susan smiled for the first time all week, and it was nothing like the polite, almost practiced expressions she'd been wearing around Harold. This smile was sharp, predatory, and absolutely beautiful. "Patricia, I think Harold made a serious miscalculation when he hired me. He assumed I was just another ambitious woman desperate enough to tolerate his behavior for career advancement. What he doesn't know is that I've been documenting workplace harassment for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for 3 years. Harold didn't hire a victim. He hired his worst nightmare." The room felt electric with possibility. Susan wasn't just agreeing to help. She was revealing that she'd been fighting Harold's type of abuse professionally for years. Together, we weren't just two angry women. We were Harold's complete destruction, walking through his door with briefcases and business cards. "Then we need to establish ground rules," I said, opening my laptop. If we're doing this, we're doing it perfectly. That night, I drove home with my mind racing faster than it had in years. Susan's revelation about her EOC experience changed everything. I wasn't just planning personal revenge anymore. I was building a legal case that could permanently end Harold's ability to destroy other women's careers. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door. The same beige walls and second-hand furniture, but suddenly the space buzzed with possibility instead of defeat. I cleared my dining room table and spread out every single piece of documentation I'd been collecting over the past 3 years. Performance reviews where Harold praised my work while denying promotions. Email threads where he took credit for my ideas. Meeting notes where he dismissed my contributions publicly. But Susan was right about establishing ground rules. Random documentation wouldn't destroy Harold. Methodical evidence gathering would. I opened a new spreadsheet and began creating categories: discriminatory behavior, financial misconduct, client relationship damage, employee turnover patterns. Each incident needed dates, witnesses, supporting documentation, and measurable impact on company performance. My first entry was Harold's treatment during last month's budget meeting. March 15th, 2:30 p.m., conference room. Harold interrupted my financial projections 6 times, each interruption designed to make me appear unprepared. Witnesses: Jennifer Lopez from marketing, David Chin from finance, Marcus Rodriguez from operations. Supporting evidence: my original presentation, saved with timestamps. Email confirming my research accuracy. Client feedback praising my financial management. By midnight, I had 47 entries spanning 3 years. Each one represented a moment where Harold had chosen cruelty over professionalism, power over confidence. Seeing the pattern laid out systematically was both validating and infuriating. Harold's behavior wasn't random mood swings or stress responses. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to keep me submissive. The next morning, I visited an electronics store and purchased a digital voice recorder smaller than my thumb. Our state's one-party consent laws meant I could legally record any conversation I participated in without Harold's knowledge. The device came with software that could timestamp recordings and convert them to text files, creating searchable transcripts of Harold's verbal abuse. Testing the recorder became my obsession. I practiced activating it smoothly while reaching for pens. I learned to position myself for optimal audio quality during meetings. I memorized the button sequences for starting and stopping recordings without even looking. Within a week, the device felt like a natural extension of my office routine. My first recorded conversation captured Harold berating Jennifer about the Morrison account timeline. I shouldn't have to explain basic project management to someone with your experience. His voice came through clearly on playback. Maybe women just aren't wired for handling multiple deadlines simultaneously. Jennifer's quiet response, accepting blame for Harold's impossible scheduling, made my chest tight with that familiar, burning anger. But documentation was only half the battle. I needed Harold's personnel files, financial records, and board meeting minutes to prove his pattern of discrimination affected company performance. My access to these records came through 15 years of being Harold's unofficial assistant, handling tasks he considered beneath his attention. Late Thursday evening, I stayed behind after the cleaning crew finished their rounds. Harold's office door required a key card that I technically wasn't authorized to use, but Harold had given me access years ago for handling his emergency situations. I slipped inside and photographed his personnel files with my phone, focusing on hiring decisions, promotion timelines, and salary comparisons between male and female employees. The numbers were damning. Harold consistently offered female employees starting salaries 12 to 15% lower than equivalent male hires. Women received smaller annual increases, fewer performance bonuses, and longer probationary periods. The pattern held across departments and experience levels, proving Harold's discrimination was systematic rather than coincidental. But the financial records revealed Harold's most dangerous secret. He'd been billing personal expenses to company accounts for over 2 years. His wife's monthly spa treatments appeared as executive wellness consultations. His son's private school tuition was listed as educational partnership investments. Weekend golf trips with his brother-in-law became strategic planning retreats, costing thousands of dollars each month. Most damaging was Harold's consulting arrangement with Meridian Advisory Services, a company owned by his brother Frank. Harold had paid Frank's company nearly $300,000 over 18 months for strategic guidance that consisted of monthly lunch meetings and vague reports recommending Harold continue his current leadership approach. The consulting fees were 3 times industry standard rates, and Frank's company had no other clients or demonstrated expertise in our field. I photographed everything: invoices, bank statements, board authorizations Harold had forged, email conversations with Frank discussing how to make their arrangement appear legitimate. Harold wasn't just a workplace bully. He was embezzling company funds to maintain his lavish lifestyle while denying employee raises and cutting department budgets. Susan proved invaluable for gathering intelligence Harold would never share with me. During her 3rd week, Harold invited her to a strategy session that was actually a fishing expedition to learn her personal boundaries. Susan wore the wire I'd given her, capturing Harold's increasingly inappropriate comments about her appearance and his hints about career advancement depending on their personal chemistry. Harold actually said, "The promotion track for women requires different skills than men," Susan reported during our evening debriefing session in my car. We'd started meeting in the parking garage after hours, our voices barely above whispers despite the privacy. He suggested that successful women know how to make powerful men comfortable, then asked if I understood what he meant. "Did you respond?" I asked. I told him I believed in earning advancement through exceptional work performance. He laughed and said that was admirable, but naive. Then he touched my shoulder while saying some women need guidance understanding workplace dynamics. Each recording Susan brought me added another piece to Harold's psychological profile. He tested boundaries gradually, escalating inappropriate behavior while maintaining plausible deniability. Comments about appearance became suggestions about after-work meetings. Professional compliments included unnecessary physical contact. Harold was grooming Susan exactly as he had groomed his previous victims. But Susan's most valuable intelligence came from Harold's private phone conversations. His office walls were thin, and Susan's adjacent workspace allowed her to overhear Harold's discussions with board members about company performance. Harold consistently blamed declining metrics on employee incompetence while taking credit for any positive outcomes. He told board chairman Robert Mills that our client retention problems stemmed from inadequate support staff rather than his own relationship management failures. Harold actually told Mills that I need constant supervision because women struggle with independent decision-making, Susan whispered during one of our parking garage meetings. He said my promotion was an experiment in diversity hiring that might not work out. These recorded conversations revealed Harold's true opinions about female employees, opinions that directly contradicted his public support for workplace equality. Every board member conversation Susan captured added weight to our discrimination case, proving Harold's bias affected strategic business decisions. By month's end, we had accumulated evidence that would destroy Harold professionally and personally. Recorded conversations proving deliberate discrimination. Financial documents showing systematic embezzlement. Personnel records demonstrating illegal hiring and promotion practices. Client correspondence revealing Harold's damage to business relationships through unprofessional behavior. But the most powerful evidence was Harold's own words. 3 weeks of recorded conversations where he revealed his true character, his contempt for female employees, his belief that women existed primarily to serve male authority figures. Harold had documented his own destruction simply by speaking honestly when he thought no one important was listening. The final piece came when Susan discovered Harold's plan to fire me before my 15-year anniversary to avoid paying accumulated vacation time and retirement contributions. He discussed the strategy with his brother during one of their fraudulent consulting meetings, outlining how to document performance issues that would justify immediate termination without severance pay. "He's planning to destroy you anyway," Susan said, sliding the recording device across my kitchen table. "Harold told Frank that keeping you around makes him look weak, like he can't control his own employees. He wants you gone before you become a liability." Hearing Harold's casual discussion of my professional execution crystallized my resolve. He wasn't just taking credit for my work or denying me promotions. He was planning to erase 15 years of my career while stealing the retirement benefits I'd earned through loyal service. That night, I organized everything into a comprehensive presentation that would show the board exactly who Harold really was. Financial theft, systematic discrimination, client relationship damage, employee harassment, and illegal termination planning. Each section included timestamps, witnesses, recorded conversations, and documented business impact. Susan and I spent hours rehearsing our revelation strategy. She would continue playing Harold's ideal victim while I prepared for the confrontation that would end his career. The envelope I'd prepared wasn't just a resignation letter. It was Harold's complete professional obituary, written in his own words and documented with irrefutable evidence. Harold thought he was playing chess while I moved checker pieces. He had no idea I'd been learning an entirely different game. Teaching Susan to manipulate Harold without losing her soul became my most delicate challenge. We met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, far enough to avoid unexpected encounters with colleagues. Susan stirred her latte nervously, still processing the scope of evidence we'd accumulated. "I need you to understand Harold's psychological triggers," I began, sliding a notebook across the small table. "He operates on validation and control. Feed his ego and he'll reveal secrets he should keep private. Challenge his authority and he'll destroy you professionally." Susan opened the notebook to pages of behavioral observations I'd collected over years of working with Harold. "He needs to feel like the smartest person in every room," she read aloud. "He craves acknowledgement for ideas that aren't his. He becomes defensive when questioned about details because he rarely understands implementation. Tomorrow, try asking his opinion about the Henderson Group's quarterly review," I instructed. "Tell him you value his strategic insight. Harold will spend 20 minutes explaining marketing concepts you understood before you graduated college, but he'll also accidentally reveal confidential client information he shouldn't share. Won't he realize I'm manipulating him?" Susan asked, her brow furrowed. "Harold's biggest weakness is believing his own superiority. He thinks women naturally defer to male authority. So your questions will feel like appropriate respect rather than strategic intelligence gathering." The next day, Susan executed our plan perfectly. She knocked on Harold's office door around 10 a.m., carrying a legal pad and wearing an expression of professional confusion. Through his glass walls, I watched Harold's posture change from distracted annoyance to pleased attention when Susan asked for his guidance. 25 minutes later, Susan emerged with 3 pages of notes and Harold's complete assessment of our client base, including confidential information about contract negotiations, budget constraints, and competitive threats. Harold had revealed strategic details that should have required board-level authorization to share. "He actually told me which clients are considering leaving and why," Susan whispered during our coffee break. "He said the Henderson Group thinks our pricing model is outdated, but he's not planning to adjust rates because he believes they're bluffing about terminating their contract." Harold's arrogance was becoming our greatest weapon. His need to appear knowledgeable overrode his business judgment, creating opportunities for Susan to extract information that revealed his incompetence. Over the following weeks, Susan perfected her performance. She learned to laugh at Harold's terrible jokes, nod appreciatively during his rambling monologues, and ask questions that made him feel intellectually superior. Her acting was flawless because it served a purpose beyond mere manipulation. Every conversation with Harold generated evidence for our case. But timing our revelation required surgical precision. The quarterly board meeting was 6 weeks away, providing enough time to gather comprehensive evidence while ensuring Harold felt completely secure before we destroyed him. Susan and I studied the board members' backgrounds, identifying their individual concerns and motivations. Robert Mills, board chairman, cared primarily about financial performance and legal liability. Elena Vasquez focused on employee satisfaction and company culture. Thomas Chung worried about client retention and market position. Dr. Margaret Foster emphasized ethical leadership and community reputation. Each board member would respond differently to Harold's misconduct, requiring tailored approaches for maximum impact. Mills will want hard numbers showing how Harold's behavior affects profitability, I explained to Susan during one of our planning sessions. Vasquez needs employee testimony and documentation of a hostile work environment. Chong requires proof that Harold's damaging client relationships through unprofessional conduct. And Dr. Foster? Foster founded the Meridian Community Scholarship Program. She believes business success should contribute to social responsibility. Harold's treatment of female employees directly contradicts everything Foster stands for professionally and personally. We developed presentation materials targeting each board member's priorities. Financial analysis for Mills. Employee survey data for Vasquez. Client feedback reports for Chong. Community impact assessments for Foster. Our evidence would speak their language, making Harold's removal feel inevitable rather than vindictive. Susan's role required constant performance pressure that would have broken most people. She had to endure Harold's inappropriate comments while secretly recording them, accept credit for my work while documenting the theft, and maintain professional composure while planning Harold's destruction. Her strength impressed me daily. Some mornings I wake up wanting to walk into Harold's office and tell him exactly what I think of his management style. Susan confessed during a particularly difficult week when Harold had escalated his inappropriate behavior. "What stops you?" I asked, knowing that 30 minutes of satisfaction would mean Harold learns our plan and starts covering his tracks. I'd rather endure 6 more weeks of his nonsense and watch him lose everything permanently. Our contingency planning consumed entire weekends. We anticipated Harold's likely responses to our accusations: denial, character assassination, claims of conspiracy, threats of retaliation. For each potential defense, we prepared counter-evidence that would neutralize his arguments. Harold might claim our recordings were taken out of context, so we documented patterns spanning months rather than isolated incidents. He might accuse us of colluding against him, so we prepared testimony from other employees who had witnessed his behavior independently. He might threaten our careers, so we consulted employment attorneys who confirmed our legal protections against retaliation. The most crucial element was protecting ourselves from immediate termination. Harold's response to exposure would likely be firing us both before we could present evidence to the board. Susan's solution was brilliant. She suggested we schedule our revelation during a board meeting. Harold couldn't control or cancel it without raising suspicions. Harold always schedules his quarterly presentation for maximum impact, Susan observed. He wants board members focused on his achievements, not distracted by personnel issues. If we time our revelation perfectly, Harold won't be able to shut us down without confirming everything we're accusing him of doing. 3 weeks before the board meeting, we began our final preparations. Susan continued gathering Harold's incriminating statements while I refined our evidence into an irrefutable case. Every document was organized, every recording transcribed, every financial discrepancy calculated and cross-referenced. The envelope I carried in my briefcase contained 15 pages of evidence that would end Harold's career: board member contact information, legal documentation, recorded conversations, financial analysis, and a timeline showing 3 years of systematic abuse. Harold's destruction was complete. He just didn't know it yet. Susan and I exchanged glances across the conference room where Harold was announcing her promotion. Neither of us smiled, but we didn't need to. Harold was about to learn that his perfect victims had become his perfect executioners. The morning of our confrontation arrived, gray and drizzling, matching my carefully practiced mood. I stood before my bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., perfecting the defeated posture I'd worn for 15 years, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes downcast but not defiant, hands clasped in front of my body. The submissive stance Harold expected from his female employees. But this morning, the posture was pure performance. Underneath my gray blazer, my heart beat with anticipation rather than anxiety. The envelope in my briefcase contained Harold's complete professional destruction, organized into 15 pages that would end his career within hours. 3 years of discriminatory behavior, financial theft, client relationship damage, and systematic harassment of female employees, all documented with timestamps, recordings, and irrefutable evidence. I'd spent the previous evening reviewing every document, ensuring our case was bulletproof. Harold's recorded conversations where he admitted manipulating female employees, bank statements proving his embezzlement of company funds, email threads showing his deliberate sabotage of women's careers, personnel files revealing salary discrimination across all departments. The evidence painted a picture so clear that even Harold's allies on the board would abandon him to protect themselves. The envelope itself was symbolic perfection. White linen paper, Harold's favorite for important correspondence, sealed with the company logo stickers he insisted on using for board communications. Harold would recognize the formal presentation style he demanded from subordinates, never suspecting the contents would destroy everything he'd built. Susan arrived at the office looking flawless as always, her burgundy dress and professional smile giving no hint of the performance she was about to deliver. We'd rehearsed this morning dozens of times, but seeing her in character felt surreal. She was about to sacrifice her promotion, her income, and potentially her career to help me achieve justice neither of us could accomplish alone. Harold called his special meeting for 10 a.m., gathering the management team in the main conference room for what he believed would be Susan's celebratory moment. Jennifer from marketing brought congratulations cards. David from finance prepared budget allocation discussions. Marcus from operations drafted transition timeline proposals. Everyone arrived expecting routine promotion announcements and departmental planning. I entered the conference room carrying my briefcase and wearing my most professionally defeated expression. Harold beamed at the assembled team, clearly anticipating their approval of his leadership decision. Susan sat in the chair Harold had designated for her, the seat of honor beside his usual position at the head of the table. "Thank you all for attending on short notice," Harold began, his voice carrying that false warmth he used for important occasions. "Today marks an exciting evolution in Meridian's leadership structure. Susan's promotion to marketing director represents our commitment to innovative thinking and strategic excellence." The management team applauded politely while I maintained my submissive posture, hands folded in my lap, eyes focused on the table surface. Inside, I counted each second until Harold would destroy himself with his own words. "Patricia has been invaluable in supporting our marketing efforts over the years," Harold continued, his tone shifting to the patronizing warmth he used when discussing loyal but limited employees. "However, Meridian's future requires fresh perspectives and advanced strategic thinking that, frankly, Patricia's skill set cannot provide." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her seat. David's smile faltered slightly. Marcus stopped taking notes and looked directly at Harold with obvious disapproval. Even Harold's supporters recognized the cruelty of his public assessment. But Harold was just getting started. His confidence grew with each dismissive comment, his voice becoming more animated as he described my inadequacies and Susan's superior qualifications. He was giving me exactly what I needed, a room full of witnesses hearing him humiliate a loyal employee while revealing his true character. "Frankly, I've been too generous keeping Patricia in her current role this long," Harold declared, leaning back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. "She lacks the vision necessary for strategic marketing leadership. Susan represents the kind of forward-thinking professional Meridian needs to remain competitive." The words should have devastated me. 3 years ago, they would have sent me home crying and questioning my self-worth. Instead, I felt Harold sealing his own fate with every cruel syllable. He was creating the perfect context for our revelation, painting himself as the heartless boss whose comeuppance would feel completely justified. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew the envelope, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what was about to happen. Harold noticed the movement but continued his speech, probably assuming I was preparing resignation paperwork or notes for transitioning my responsibilities to Susan. "Patricia's work has been adequate for maintaining existing client relationships," Harold said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But adequacy isn't enough anymore. We need excellence, innovation, strategic thinking that challenges conventional approaches." I stood slowly, maintaining my defeated posture as I approached Harold's chair. The management team watched curiously, probably expecting some kind of gracious acceptance speech or formal transition announcement. Harold paused his monologue, smiling expectantly as I placed the envelope on the table before him. "Thank you for the opportunity, Harold," I said quietly, using the same submissive tone I'd perfected over years of his abuse. "I think you'll find everything you need right there." Harold's smile widened as he picked up the envelope, clearly expecting resignation papers that would complete his victory over me. His fingers worked the seal confidently while he basked in the management team's attention. This was Harold's moment of triumph, his public demonstration of authority and superior judgment. The first page made his face go pale. By the second page, his hands began trembling. The third page caused him to stop breathing entirely. Harold's expression transformed from smug confidence to absolute terror as he realized he was holding evidence of every crime he'd committed against the company and its employees. "What is this?" Harold whispered, his voice barely audible. "Your performance review," I said, still maintaining my quiet tone. 3 years of documented misconduct, financial theft, discriminatory behavior, and systematic harassment. Everything the board needs to understand exactly what kind of leader you've been. The conference room fell silent as everyone sensed something monumental was happening. Harold's face cycled through disbelief, panic, and desperate calculation as he flipped through pages of his own recorded words, documented crimes, and irrefutable proof of systematic abuse. Then Susan stood up, and everything changed forever. "Harold," she said, her voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. "I think there's been some confusion about my role here." Harold looked up from the damning documents, his face still white with shock. "Susan, whatever Patricia has told you, she's clearly unstable. This is obviously some kind of breakdown." "Actually, Harold," Susan countered, her voice unwavering, "Patricia and I have been working together for weeks. Every conversation you've had with me, every inappropriate comment, every recorded statement about your female employees, it's all been documented with my full cooperation." The transformation in Susan was breathtaking. Gone was the deferential new hire who had smiled politely at Harold's condescending explanations. In her place stood a confident professional who had been playing a role with Oscar-worthy precision. She reached into her own briefcase and withdrew a second envelope, this one containing recordings of Harold's attempts to manipulate her into submission. "You recorded me?" Harold's voice cracked with disbelief. "I recorded you confessing to systematic discrimination, financial fraud, and harassment of multiple employees," Susan corrected him, her voice cold and clear. "Patricia and I have been building a case that will destroy your career and potentially result in criminal charges." The management team sat frozen, finally understanding they were witnessing Harold's complete exposure rather than another employee's humiliation. Jennifer's hand covered her mouth in shock. David stared at his notes as if they might explain what was happening. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from confusion to what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Harold's phone buzzed against the conference table. Then again. Within minutes, calls were coming from board members who had received advanced copies of our evidence package. Susan and I had timed our revelation perfectly, ensuring board members would review Harold's crimes while he sat helpless in a room full of witnesses. "Board members are requesting an emergency meeting," Harold announced, his voice hollow as he read text messages that were clearly devastating. "They want to discuss personnel matters." "They want to discuss your termination," I corrected, finally abandoning my submissive posture and sitting up straight. "Robert Mills received our evidence package at 9 a.m. this morning. Elena Vasquez has been reviewing recorded conversations since 9:15. Dr. Foster is currently examining financial documents proving you've stolen over $200,000 from company accounts." Harold's jaw dropped. "You contacted the board behind my back?" "We contacted the board with evidence of criminal behavior that affects their fiduciary responsibilities," I stated. "They have legal obligations to investigate misconduct that creates liability for shareholders." 40 minutes later, board members began arriving at the office. Robert Mills looked grim as he strode past Harold's desk without acknowledgement. Elena Vasquez carried a folder thick with printed emails and transcripts. Thomas Chung spoke quietly with Dr. Foster near the elevator, both their expressions serious enough to suggest they'd already reached conclusions about Harold's future. The emergency meeting convened in the large conference room, with Harold sitting at one end of the table like a defendant facing judgment. Board members arranged themselves along both sides, their body language suggesting they'd already distanced themselves from Harold's leadership. Susan and I sat together opposite Harold, our evidence organized into presentation folders for each board member. "Harold," Robert Mills began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built 3 successful companies before joining our board. "We've reviewed extensive documentation of your conduct over the past 3 years. Before we proceed with formal actions, do you have any explanation for the behavior described in these materials?" Harold attempted his usual charm offensive, flashing the smile that had carried him through countless previous crises. "Bob, I think there's been some misunderstanding here. Patricia is clearly struggling with workplace transitions, and Susan seems to have been influenced by someone with obvious grudges against company leadership. Harold, Dr. Foster interrupted, her voice cutting through his deflection with surgical precision. We have recordings of you admitting to discriminatory hiring practices. We have bank statements showing personal expenses charged to company accounts. We have documentation of salary disparities that violate federal employment law. This isn't about workplace transitions or personal grudges. This is about criminal misconduct. Harold's charm crumbled instantly. His face flushed red as he realized his usual manipulation tactics were powerless against documented evidence. Those recordings were taken without my consent, he protested. In a one-party consent state where Patricia was legally authorized to record workplace conversations, Elena Vasquez stated flatly, "Your privacy rights don't supersede federal discrimination laws or embezzlement statutes." The vote of no confidence took less than 5 minutes. Each board member stated their position clearly. Harold's continued leadership represented unacceptable legal and financial risk to the company. The motion passed unanimously, with Harold himself unable to vote due to an obvious conflict of interest. Harold Thompson, you are hereby removed from all executive positions, effective immediately, Mills announced. Security will escort you from the building after you surrender company property, including keys, credit cards, and electronic devices. Harold's final plea was pathetic. Please, I can change. I can fix this. Give me another chance to prove I've learned from these mistakes. Harold, Dr. Foster said gently. These weren't mistakes. They were choices. 3 years of documented choices that harmed employees, clients, and shareholders. The board cannot ignore evidence this comprehensive. Security arrived within minutes. 2 professional guards who treated Harold with polite efficiency while collecting his belongings. Watching Harold's personal items being packed into cardboard boxes felt surreal. After 15 years of fearing his authority, his expensive fountain pens, framed family photos, golf trophies, and business awards, all the symbols of his success reduced to objects being inventoried by strangers. Patricia, Mills said as Harold was being escorted toward the elevator. The board would like to discuss interim leadership arrangements. Are you available for a private conversation? 30 minutes later, I sat in the same chair where Harold had once delivered my performance reviews, listening to board members offer me his position, interim CEO, while they conducted a formal search for permanent leadership. Harold's salary. Harold's office. Harold's authority over the company he'd nearly destroyed through greed and cruelty. We understand this transition might feel overwhelming, Dr. Foster said kindly. Take time to consider whether you're interested in the responsibility. I looked around the conference room where Harold had humiliated me countless times, where I'd sat silently while he took credit for my work, where I'd endured years of professional abuse because I believed endurance was my only option. Now these same walls would witness my transformation from Harold's victim to his replacement. I accept, I said, my voice steady and clear. And I have some ideas about Harold's future employment that I think you'll find interesting. 2 weeks later, Harold Thompson walked through the same glass doors where I'd entered 15 years ago as a hopeful young woman. But Harold wasn't arriving for his first day at a dream job. He was reporting for duty as my executive assistant, carrying a brown bag lunch and wearing a suit that suddenly looked too expensive for his new circumstances. I watched from my office, Harold's former office, as he stood uncertainly beside the small desk we'd positioned directly outside my door. The desk was cramped, functional, and positioned so Harold would see everyone who entered my workspace. More importantly, everyone would see Harold sitting there, reduced from CEO to secretary, handling appointments and filing papers for the woman he'd spent years humiliating. His first task was organizing my calendar, something I'd been managing myself for months during the interim period. Harold stared at the computer screen with obvious confusion, clicking through scheduling software he'd never needed to understand. As CEO, Harold had simply told his secretary when he wanted meetings. He'd never learned to coordinate multiple schedules, handle conflicts, or manage the detailed logistics of executive calendaring. Harold, I called from my desk, using the same patient, slightly exasperated tone he'd once used to explain simple concepts to me. Remember to check the boardroom availability before scheduling the Henderson Group presentation. We don't want any embarrassing double bookings on your first week. His jaw tightened, but he nodded politely. Of course, Miss Wallace. I'll verify room availability immediately. Miss Wallace. After 15 years of calling me Patricia, dismissing my contributions, and treating me as interchangeable office furniture, Harold was finally using my title. The formality felt delicious, especially knowing it represented genuine respect born from fear rather than politeness born from kindness. My phone rang and I answered while watching Harold struggle with calendar software through my open office door. Patricia Wallace speaking. Miss Wallace, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison Industries. We're thrilled about the leadership changes at Meridian. Harold Thompson was becoming increasingly difficult to work with, and frankly, we were considering terminating our contract. Your reputation in the industry is excellent, and we're excited about continuing our partnership under your management. Harold's head snapped up at the mention of Morrison Industries, one of our largest accounts. His face went pale as he realized clients were celebrating his removal rather than mourning his departure. The conversation lasted 15 minutes, with Janet praising my professionalism and expressing relief about not having to deal with Harold's condescending attitude anymore. After hanging up, I walked to Harold's desk and handed him a stack of expense reports that needed filing. These require alphabetical organization by vendor, then chronological arrangement by date within each category. Make sure the calculations are accurate to the penny. Harold looked at the papers with obvious distress. Mathematical accuracy had never been his strength. He'd always delegated detailed work to subordinates while taking credit for their results. Now he was the subordinate, struggling with tasks that required patience and precision rather than executive authority. Miss Wallace, I'm having some difficulty with the expense report categorization. Could you provide additional guidance about your preferred filing system? The question revealed Harold's fundamental problem. He'd never learned to perform work, only to delegate it. 15 years of having others handle details had left him helpless when faced with actual job responsibilities. I pulled up a chair beside his desk and proceeded to explain filing procedures with the same condescending patience he'd once used to teach me simple concepts I already understood. Now, Harold, I know this might seem complex, but try to follow along. Vendor names go in alphabetical order. A comes before B, B comes before C. Can you handle that level of complexity, or do you need me to write down the alphabet for reference? His cheeks burned with humiliation, but Harold nodded and attempted to reorganize the papers. Watching him struggle with basic office procedures while fighting to maintain his dignity was more satisfying than I'd imagined. Every fumbled task reminded Harold that competence couldn't be faked, delegated, or stolen from subordinates. The afternoon brought Harold's first encounter with his former management team as equals. Jennifer Lopez arrived for our 3 p.m. marketing strategy meeting, walking past Harold's desk without acknowledgement. She knocked on my office door and waited for permission to enter, treating Harold like invisible office furniture. Jennifer, please come in. Harold, bring your notepad and pen. You'll be taking minutes for this meeting. Harold's shock was visible. As CEO, he'd never taken meeting notes, considering documentation work beneath executive attention. Now, he was expected to capture detailed discussions while remaining silent unless specifically asked to contribute. The meeting revealed how much Harold's leadership had damaged team dynamics. Jennifer spoke freely for the first time in years, sharing innovative ideas she'd been afraid to voice during Harold's regime. She outlined digital marketing strategies that could increase client engagement by 40%, proposals that Harold had consistently dismissed as too risky or unnecessarily complex. These are brilliant concepts, Jennifer, I said, reviewing her presentation materials. Why haven't we implemented these strategies before? Jennifer glanced nervously at Harold, who was dutifully scribbling notes, while his face grew redder with each compliment I gave his former subordinate. Previous management felt these approaches were premature for our client base. Previous management was wrong, I stated. Let's schedule implementation meetings for next week. Harold's pen stopped moving. He just heard his strategic judgment publicly contradicted and his replacement announce plans that would prove his leadership had been holding the company back. The humiliation was perfect, watching Harold document his own professional inadequacy while sitting silently in the room where he'd once wielded absolute authority. 5 p.m. brought Harold's most painful realization. His former colleagues began leaving for the day, calling out casual goodbyes to me while completely ignoring Harold's presence. David from finance stopped by my office to discuss quarterly projections, speaking as if Harold wasn't sitting 3 feet away taking phone messages. Harold, I said as the office emptied. Tomorrow morning, I need you here at 7. We have early calls with West Coast clients, and I'll need coffee ready and meeting materials prepared before the first call. Harold's jaw worked silently. As CEO, he'd rarely arrived before 9 a.m., leaving early morning responsibilities to support staff he'd never bothered to acknowledge. Now he was the support staff, expected to facilitate meetings for someone he'd considered inferior for 15 years. 7 a.m., Miss Wallace. I'll have everything prepared. Walking Harold to the elevator at the end of his first day felt like crossing a finish line I'd been running toward for years. He looked exhausted, defeated, and smaller somehow, as if losing his authority had physically diminished him. Harold, I said as the elevator doors opened. Tomorrow, we'll discuss your performance goals and professional development opportunities. I think you'll find my management style very educational. The doors closed on Harold's stricken face, leaving me alone in the executive floor that was finally, truly mine. Harold's education and humility began in earnest the following Monday morning. I arrived at 7 a.m. to find him already at his desk, fumbling with the coffee machine instructions I'd left him. His expensive Italian suit looked absurdly formal for someone whose primary responsibility was ensuring my morning espresso was perfectly prepared. Good morning, Harold, I said cheerfully, settling into my office chair. I trust you've reviewed today's schedule and prepared the materials for our 8 a.m. client call. Harold's face flushed as he realized he'd forgotten about the Henderson Group conference call entirely. I apologize, Miss Wallace. I'll gather those materials immediately. No need to rush, I replied, using the same dismissive tone Harold had perfected during my years of scrambling to fix his oversights. I suppose I should have been clearer about expectations, though I did think basic preparation was obvious for someone with your experience. The phrase hung in the air between us. Harold recognized his own words, the same condescending language he'd used countless times when I'd failed to read his mind about unstated requirements. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he processed hearing his favorite put-down delivered with perfect mimicry of his patronizing tone. During the Henderson Group call, I positioned Harold at the conference table with a notepad while I handled the actual business discussion. His job was documentation, not participation, a role reversal that made his discomfort obvious to everyone in the room. When Harold attempted to contribute strategic insights, I interrupted with gentle but firm redirection. Harold, please focus on capturing accurate notes. We'll discuss your observations afterward during our feedback session. The dismissal was surgical, delivered with professional politeness that made Harold's exclusion from decision-making crystal clear. Jennifer and Marcus exchanged glances across the table, both obviously enjoying Harold's reduction to secretarial duties. The man who had once dominated every meeting was now relegated to silent documentation while others conducted business. But my real psychological warfare began during our daily check-in meetings. I scheduled them for 4:30 p.m., the exact time Harold used to summon me for his critiques of my performance. The meetings followed Harold's old format, detailed review of daily tasks, criticism of minor errors, and vague suggestions for improvement that were impossible to implement. Harold, I noticed several issues with today's client correspondence. I began during our first official feedback session. Your email to Morrison Industries used casual language inappropriate for executive communications. The Henderson Group follow-up lacked specific action items, and your calendar management resulted in a double booking that required embarrassing corrections. Harold sat across from my desk in the same chair where I'd endured years of similar criticism. His hands gripped his notepad as he struggled to maintain professional composure while absorbing public critique of his performance. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Harold was experiencing the same systematic undermining he'd perfected as a management technique. I understand your concerns, Miss Wallace. How would you suggest I improve these areas? Well, Harold, I thought effective communication was obvious for someone in your position. Perhaps you need additional training in professional correspondence. I could arrange for you to shadow Jennifer during client interactions so you can observe proper business etiquette. Harold's face went white. The suggestion that he needed training from a former subordinate was devastating enough, but offering to let Jennifer witness his incompetence added public humiliation to professional instruction. Harold was learning that mentorship could be weaponized just as effectively as criticism. 3 weeks into Harold's new position, his facade began cracking during team meetings. When Marcus mentioned budget constraints affecting the operations department, Harold instinctively tried to provide executive guidance. In my experience, budget challenges require strategic prioritization of core competencies while eliminating redundant expenditures. Harold, I interrupted gently. Your role is documentation, not strategy consultation. Please return to your notes. The correction was delivered with professional kindness that made Harold's humiliation more complete than any harsh reprimand could have achieved. Around the table, his former equals watched his authority being stripped away with calm efficiency. Harold's attempt to reclaim relevance had backfired, emphasizing his irrelevance instead. The breaking point came during Harold's 6th week as my assistant. He'd been struggling with expense report calculations all morning, his mathematical errors requiring constant corrections that delayed important financial submissions. When I called him into my office for our daily feedback session, Harold's composure finally shattered. Patricia, please, he whispered, abandoning all pretense of professional formality. I can't do this anymore. This job is destroying me. The humiliation, the menial tasks, watching everyone treat me like I'm invisible. It's unbearable. Tears began flowing down Harold's cheeks as 15 years of arrogance collapsed into desperate pleading. I'll do anything to get my old life back. I'll change how I treat employees. I'll respect women's contributions. I'll stop taking credit for other people's work. Just please, give me another chance to prove I can be the leader you deserve. I listened to Harold's breakdown with the same cold professionalism he'd once used during my moments of vulnerability. When he finished begging, I handed him a tissue box and waited for him to compose himself before responding. Harold, actions have consequences. You spent 15 years building a reputation as someone who destroys women's careers for personal entertainment. Those consequences don't disappear because you finally experience the receiving end of workplace cruelty. But I've learned my lesson. I understand now how wrong I was. You understand that being mistreated feels bad. That's not the same as understanding that mistreating others is wrong. Your regret is about your situation, not about the pain you caused other people. Harold's shoulders sagged as he realized his tears wouldn't move me. He'd created a monster through years of systematic abuse, and now that monster was treating him with the same merciless efficiency he'd once demonstrated. The student had become the teacher, and Harold's education in consequences was just beginning. Outside my office window, Harold's wife sat in her car in the visitor parking section, waiting to pick him up because he could no longer afford his BMW lease payments. Their conversation through the glass looked heated, with Harold gesturing frantically while his wife's expression grew increasingly distant. Even his family relationships were crumbling under the weight of his professional destruction, and Harold was finally learning that respect couldn't be demanded, only earned through consistent, decent behavior. The moment that sealed Harold's fate came during our presentation to Blackstone Industries, our most prestigious potential client. Harold was supposed to sit quietly and take notes while I delivered the marketing strategy proposal. Instead, he decided to demonstrate his value by interjecting outdated information that contradicted everything we'd prepared. If I may add to Miss Wallace's presentation, Harold interrupted, rising from his chair at the back of the conference room. The 3 Blackstone executives looked confused as Harold launched into a rambling explanation of market penetration strategies that had been obsolete for 5 years. Traditional demographic targeting remains the foundation of effective campaign development, Harold declared confidently. Digital engagement metrics are interesting supplementary data, but proven print advertising and direct mail campaigns provide measurable returns that social media simply cannot match. The lead Blackstone executive, Maria Santos, exchanged puzzled glances with her colleagues. They had specifically requested our digital transformation expertise, making Harold's anti-technology speech particularly inappropriate. I watched their expressions shift from professional interest to genuine concern about our company's strategic understanding. I appreciate Harold's historical perspective, I said, stepping forward to regain control of the presentation. However, our current approach focuses on integrated digital strategies that align with contemporary consumer behavior patterns. But the damage was done. Harold's interference had made us appear divided and unprofessional exactly when we needed to project unified confidence. After the clients left, I called Harold into my office for an immediate performance discussion. Harold, your behavior during the Blackstone presentation was completely unacceptable. You were specifically instructed to document the meeting, not participate in strategic discussions. I was trying to help, Harold protested. Those clients needed to understand traditional marketing fundamentals before embracing trendy digital approaches. Those clients specifically requested digital transformation strategies, I countered, my voice sharp. Your outdated opinions made us look incompetent and cost us a potential $1 million contract. Harold's face crumpled as he realized his attempt to demonstrate value had achieved the opposite result. I didn't mean to cause problems. I thought my experience would be valuable. Your experience is exactly what nearly destroyed this company. That's why you're taking notes instead of making decisions. Meanwhile, Harold's personal life was disintegrating with equal speed. His wife, Linda, had started asking uncomfortable questions about his dramatic change in schedule and income. Harold's attempts to explain his situation without revealing the truth created increasingly elaborate lies that Linda wasn't buying. Harold claims he requested a position change to reduce stress. Linda told her sister during a phone call that Harold accidentally overheard, but his behavior has been erratic for months. He comes home angry, makes cryptic comments about workplace politics, and keeps checking job boards late at night. Linda's sister, Carol, had worked in human resources for 20 years and recognized the signs of someone who'd been fired or demoted for cause. Her subsequent investigation led her to former Meridian employees who were happy to share their experiences with Harold's management style. Within days, Linda knew the truth about her husband's character and the reasons for his professional destruction. The confrontation between Harold and Linda happened in their kitchen on a Thursday evening. I only learned the details because Harold arrived at work Friday morning looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect grooming replaced by wrinkled clothes and bloodshot eyes. My wife is filing for divorce, Harold announced during our morning check-in, his voice hollow with defeat. She said she can't be married to someone who built their career on destroying other women's lives. The revelation hit Harold harder than losing his job had. Linda's rejection wasn't about money or status. It was about moral character. She couldn't respect a man who had systematically abused his authority to harm vulnerable employees. Harold's professional destruction had revealed personal failures that went far deeper than workplace misconduct. But Harold's public humiliation reached its peak when his 18-year-old son, Jason, visited the office unexpectedly. Jason had come to surprise his father with lunch, remembering how Harold used to take him to expensive restaurants during school breaks. Instead, Jason found his father sitting at a tiny desk outside my office, struggling to schedule appointments and organize filing systems. Dad? Jason's voice carried confusion and disappointment as he watched Harold fumble with basic administrative tasks. What are you doing? Harold's face went scarlet as he tried to explain his situation without admitting to the behavior that caused it. I'm working in a consulting capacity with Ms. Wallace on operational efficiency improvements. But Jason wasn't stupid. He could see his father's reduced circumstances, the cramped workspace, the obvious subservience to someone Jason remembered as Harold's former subordinate. The visit lasted less than 10 minutes, but Harold's humiliation in front of his son completed his psychological destruction. After Jason left, Harold sat at his desk, staring at nothing for 20 minutes. When I assigned him afternoon filing tasks, he worked mechanically, his usual resistance replaced by hollow acceptance. Harold had finally grasped that his situation wasn't temporary embarrassment or strategic positioning. This was his life now, and everyone he cared about had witnessed his complete professional failure. Meanwhile, Meridian Solutions flourished under my leadership. Employee satisfaction scores reached company records within 3 months of Harold's removal. Client retention improved dramatically as professional relationships recovered from years of Harold's damaging behavior. Our quarterly profits exceeded projections by 30%, proving that Harold's leadership had been actively hindering company performance. The board's formal offer of permanent CEO position arrived on Harold's 8th-week anniversary as my assistant. I accepted immediately, knowing that Harold's permanent employment contract would ensure he witnessed my success daily while remaining powerless to interfere with it. Harold signed his long-term employment agreement with hands that shook from humiliation rather than excitement. He understood he had no other options. His reputation in the industry was destroyed. His personal relationships were crumbling, and I was the only person willing to employ him at any salary level. The contract bound Harold to my service for 5 years, with annual performance reviews that I would conduct personally. His future depended entirely on his ability to serve competently while accepting criticism graciously. Harold had become exactly what he'd always considered me to be: powerless, dependent, and completely at his superior's mercy. 6 months into Harold's new reality, I found genuine satisfaction watching him discover skills he'd never bothered developing as CEO. Filing required alphabetical precision he'd never needed to master. Calendar coordination demanded attention to detail that Harold's secretary had always handled invisibly. Expense report calculations challenged mathematical abilities he delegated to accounting departments throughout his career. Harold's most revealing struggle came with technology systems that regular employees navigated effortlessly. The customer relationship management software frustrated him daily, its multiple screens and data entry requirements overwhelming someone who'd always had others input information while he made grand strategic pronouncements. I watched Harold hunt and peck at his keyboard, using 2 fingers to type emails that took him 30 minutes to compose. "Harold," I said during one of our afternoon check-ins, "the Morrison Industries follow-up email contains 3 spelling errors and uses completely inappropriate formatting. Please revise it before sending, and next time, use spell check software like everyone else." Harold's jaw clenched as he accepted my correction, his pride warring with necessity. As CEO, he'd never proofread his own communications, relying on support staff to polish his scattered thoughts into professional correspondence. Now he was the support staff, struggling with tasks he'd considered mindless busy work when others performed them. The office dynamics evolved naturally around Harold's reduced status. New employees hired during my tenure had no knowledge of Harold's former authority, treating him simply as my administrative assistant. When recent graduate Amanda Chin joined our marketing team, she assigned Harold tasks with casual authority, never imagining the man organizing her files had once controlled the entire company. "Harold, could you make copies of these client presentations? I need 50 sets collated and stapled for tomorrow's conference," Amanda requested during her second week, handing Harold a stack of materials without a second thought. "Of course, Miss Chin," Harold replied, accepting the assignment with forced politeness. "I'll have everything ready by 8 a.m. Watching Harold serve someone young enough to be his daughter, someone who possessed the enthusiasm and potential he'd spent years crushing in others, felt like perfect cosmic justice. Amanda treated Harold with basic professional courtesy while remaining completely unimpressed by his presence, a natural response that hurt Harold more than deliberate cruelty ever could. Harold's former allies in management maintained polite distance, their casual friendships evaporating once his authority disappeared. David from finance no longer invited Harold to lunch meetings. Marcus from operations stopped asking for Harold's opinions during departmental planning sessions. Jennifer from marketing scheduled strategy discussions around Harold's availability rather than including him in decision-making processes. The most painful evolution was Harold's relationship with Patricia Rodriguez, his former executive secretary, who had become my senior administrative coordinator. Patricia had endured 5 years of Harold's demanding behavior, working late nights to compensate for his poor planning and last-minute crisis management. Now she supervised Harold's work, assigning him tasks and reviewing his performance with professional detachment. "Harold, the board meeting materials need better organization," Patricia informed him during a typical Tuesday afternoon. "Sort the financial reports by quarter, then arrange supporting documents chronologically within each section. If you're unclear about any procedures, ask for clarification rather than guessing." Harold accepted Patricia's instructions with visible difficulty, his former superiority complex warring with current necessity. He'd never learned her organizational systems because he'd considered her work beneath his attention. Now Harold was struggling to meet standards that Patricia had maintained effortlessly while also handling Harold's constantly changing demands and unreasonable deadlines. But the most profound change in Harold was his gradual recognition of the skills he'd never valued. After months of struggling with detailed administrative work, Harold began appreciating the intelligence required for tasks he dismissed as simple busy work. Calendar management demanded strategic thinking about priority conflicts. Client correspondence required understanding relationship dynamics and communication nuances. Financial documentation needed mathematical precision and regulatory knowledge. Patricia, Harold said one evening as we finished reviewing his daily performance, I never realized how complex these responsibilities actually are. When you handled my scheduling and correspondence, I thought it was just basic organizational work. The admission revealed Harold's growing awareness of his own ignorance about company operations. Years of executive isolation had separated him from the detailed work that actually kept businesses running, creating blind spots that explained many of his strategic failures as CEO. Harold's personal growth came through consequence rather than conscience, but the changes appeared genuine. He began reaching out to former female employees, offering sincere apologies for his treatment of their careers. His messages were awkward but honest, acknowledging specific harm rather than offering generic regrets. Dear Sarah, read one email Harold asked me to review before sending. I realized my behavior toward you is inexcusable and caused real damage to your career. I understand now that my actions weren't just unprofessional, but deeply harmful to someone who deserved respect and recognition. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what I did wrong. The letters were painful for Harold to write, forcing him to confront the specific ways his cruelty had affected real people with families, mortgages, and career aspirations he'd destroyed through careless selfishness. 2 years after Harold's demotion, Meridian Solutions received the Regional Business Excellence Award for Workplace Innovation and Employee Satisfaction. I accepted the recognition on behalf of our entire team, knowing that Harold was watching from his desk as I received applause for achievements that were impossible. Under his toxic leadership, standing at the podium, looking out at employees who finally felt valued and respected, I realized something Harold had never understood. True power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Harold's definition of strength had been dominance and control, but real strength was creating environments where everyone could succeed. That evening, as Harold cleaned up after our celebration reception, carefully washing glasses and folding chairs, while I reviewed congratulatory messages from industry leaders, I felt complete satisfaction with the justice we'd achieved. Harold hadn't just lost his position. He'd learned that consequences are the most effective teacher, and some lessons take years to fully understand. Susan, now our vice president of marketing, stopped by my office as Harold finished his cleaning duties. Do you ever feel guilty about how thoroughly we destroyed his life? I watched Harold empty trash cans with methodical precision, his expensive suit replaced by practical clothes appropriate for someone whose primary responsibility was supporting others' success rather than claiming it for himself. I feel grateful, I said honestly. Grateful that we proved intelligent women don't have to accept mistreatment as normal business practice. Grateful that Harold finally learned to treat people with basic human respect. And grateful that sometimes patience and planning can achieve perfect justice. 3 years passed with Harold serving faithfully as my assistant. His pride slowly rebuilt through competent work rather than stolen authority. He learned to take satisfaction in tasks completed well, relationships maintained professionally, and contributions that supported others' success rather than undermining it. On the anniversary of his original humiliation, I called Harold into my office for our final performance review. He sat across from my desk, no longer the broken man who begged for mercy, but someone who genuinely learned to respect work he'd once dismissed and people he'd once diminished. Harold, I said, placing a new contract on the desk between us. The board has authorized me to offer you a choice. He looked at the document with careful attention, reading terms that would release him from his assistant role and offer him a position as senior marketing consultant with salary and responsibilities reflecting his actual contributions rather than his past authority. You're setting me free? Harold asked, his voice carrying wonder rather than relief. I'm offering you the chance to prove that consequences can create wisdom instead of just punishment. It's your choice whether to accept growth or remain trapped in resentment about what you lost. Harold was quiet for several minutes, processing the decision that would define the rest of his career. When he finally spoke, His voice was steady and humble in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. Patricia, I want to stay, not as your assistant, but as someone who's finally learned what it means to serve others instead of using them. I've spent 3 years discovering that real satisfaction comes from contributing to something bigger than my own ego. I signed Harold's new contract with genuine respect for the person he'd become through consequence rather than choice. His transformation hadn't erased the pain he'd caused, but it proved that even the cruelest bullies could learn empathy when consequences were applied with patient precision. 6 months later, I stood before a conference of female business leaders, sharing the story of how Susan and I had transformed workplace abuse into career advancement through strategic planning and mutual support. Harold sat in the audience taking notes, not because I'd assigned the task, but because he genuinely wanted to understand how his former victims had outsmarted and outmaneuvered him so completely. After my presentation, Harold approached the podium where I was gathering my materials. Patricia, thank you for teaching me that strength isn't about controlling others. It's about empowering them to control their own destinies. Looking at Harold's sincere expression, I realized my revenge had achieved something more valuable than his destruction. It had created his redemption. The weak victim he'd imagined had become strong enough to transform her tormentor into an ally, proving that patience and intelligence triumph over cruelty and arrogance every single time. The best revenge hadn't been destroying Harold's life. It had been refusing to let him destroy mine.